Welcome back, everyone, to a different kind of reaction video today. We're going to be taking a look at a video called The Top U.S. States by Population from 1790 to 2050, which is obviously a little bit in the future based on projections of where those populations are headed. And the reason I wanted to look at this is because I think it's going to give us some unique insight into why things happened in American history the way that they did, and why certain states maybe had the influence they did, and maybe help us to see migration patterns and what's going on at different times. So I thought it'd be fun. I'll put a link in the description to the original content if you want to check that out and give that content creator some love for putting the work in to make this happen. It's only a 5-minute video, but you know me, I'll probably extend it out well beyond that. So let's go ahead and dive into this one. So I want to pause right at the beginning here. In fact, we'll back it up to 1790 so we can look at this right at the very beginning, because I want to just kind of observe where we're at. 1790, this is the first full year under the constitutional system. George Washington becomes the first president under the Constitution in 1789. So this is really right at the earliest stages of the United States of America under the Constitution. Now, the U.S. had existed for, declared independence in 1776. The Revolutionary War officially ends in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris that formally kind of signs off on everything. But this is where we're at this point. And so you see there's 700,000 estimated population in Virginia. That is by far the most populous state. So why does Virginia have so much influence? Well, there you go, you have it. It's the most populous state. It's a very wealthy state. Obviously a slaveholding state. You're going to see most of the early presidents coming from that state. People like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, James Madison, all from Virginia. Pennsylvania is second. And right there in the center, it's called the Keystone State. It's kind of the border between the New England states and the southern states. The border between Pennsylvania and Maryland has traditionally been called the Mason-Dixon line, which alludes to its being the dividing mark between slave state and free later on. But you see North Carolina is actually third in population. So that gives you a lot of insight into the power and the influence that the slave states had in forming the Constitution, and why they were able to get their way so much and really set us up for eventually having a civil war. You can see there the influence. Now, I don't know why Alaska and Alabama are just in alphabetical order as states that have no population at this point. You can see Tennessee, only 40,000 people. Officially and legally speaking, the areas west of the Appalachian Mountains are only opened up to settlement after the treaty with Great Britain, because Great Britain had some treaties in place with the Native Americans that meant that we were supposed to not be settling those areas. But of course, that was actually one of the unspoken reasons for the revolution, was opening up that land. So you're going to start to see that land gets settled quickly, places like Kentucky and Tennessee, because one of the ways they rewarded the Revolutionary War soldiers was with huge tracts of new land. And a lot of that gets settled in places like Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and other places. So you're going to very quickly see the populations of those places go up. I'm going to turn down the volume a little bit just so I can kind of talk over it. Now you can see New York is going up fast, and it's very quickly going to overtake Pennsylvania as the second most populous state, and then overtake Virginia as the most populous state. So 1804 we're into now. And at this point, Ohio has become a state. Ohio becomes a state March 1st, 1803. And we know because, of course, being from Ohio, we learned that. And so by this point, Kentucky's a state, Tennessee's a state. So you're starting to see westward expansion. It's interesting West Virginia shows up, because West Virginia is actually part of Virginia until 1863. So that really should be added to Virginia's population at this point, those western counties. Western counties of Virginia were always much more sparsely populated than the rest of the state. But you can see even now, Rhode Island, which is one of the original 13 colonies, only has 72,000 people. A year after Ohio becomes a state, it's already got twice the population that Rhode Island does, and twice the population of Delaware. So those are very small colonies there. You're starting to see Mississippi get settled. Mississippi's kind of an untamed wilderness at this point. So that's going to happen pretty slowly at first, but then eventually they'll start to open those areas up, and it'll become a prime place for slavery because of the ability to grow cotton in the Deep South. So New York, in a span, I mean, look at that. Look how quickly that happens. 1802, New York's got almost 700,000 people. And by 1807, 861,000 people, and it's starting to pass Virginia, although you still got to add that West Virginia, 100,000 total. Ohio's already up to 180,000, and they're super quickly going to rise way up to be like one of the top 3 or 4 states in population. North Carolina and Massachusetts are dropping back a little bit, and Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania dominating things. Interesting that Pennsylvania, in terms of politics, has only ever had 2 presidents born in Pennsylvania. One was James Buchanan, which is like, right before the Civil War, and then the current president, Joe Biden. So as big as Pennsylvania was, it doesn't have the influence, at least at the executive level, that New York and Virginia do. New York and Virginia are kind of dominating politics at this time, especially Federalist politics. Or not, I should say anti-Federalist, the Democratic Republicans. Now watch Ohio. So Ohio just becomes a state in 1803. Watch how quickly it moves up. Same with Kentucky. Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. These are places where Revolutionary veterans have gotten land grants. It's free land. You clear it, you own it. 40, 60, 100 acres. And so those 3 states especially see huge growth in the decades after the Revolution. Look at Ohio just jump way up there. Passes Maryland. There it passes South Carolina. 1819. Now we're into 1820. And so from 1803, when Ohio becomes a state, to 1820, it has already become the 5th most populous state. It's much, there's this area called the Northwest Territories. It's what today makes up Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And Ohio is the first of those 5 to become a state. And it kind of sets the stage then for further advancement into the other states. I think right around 1820 is when we see Indiana and Michigan becoming states. It's going to be a little bit longer for Illinois and Wisconsin. Let me double check because I can't remember for sure. So after the original 13 colonies, you have Vermont in 1791, Kentucky 1792, Tennessee in 1796, Ohio in 1803, then Louisiana in 1812, and that's almost all New Orleans for the most part at that point. Indiana 1816, Mississippi in 1817, Illinois is actually 1818 then, Alabama in 1819, Maine in 1820. Michigan doesn't become a state till 1837, so it's much later than I realized. So here you have New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, and Ohio, and then Kentucky's right there too. So you're starting to see that the center of population is moving from the South, kind of the central South, Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York being, kind of the central part of the country. Now it's all shifting to the West. And so now you have Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee rising at this point. You can see Alabama starting to climb. And it's important to notice how quickly the U.S. population is going up too. U.S. population, when we started in 1789, let's take a look at where it's at, 1790. It's around 4 million people in 1790. So then by the time we get to 1828, we're at 12, almost 13 million people. And it's hard to believe then, of course, that in the first 40 years, it triples. But then look where it's at now, over 330 million people. And so now at this point in 1831, you've got 4 states with at least 1 million people. New York's got 2 million. Remember, New York is going to be the primary place that people immigrate to. Most immigrants are coming through New York. Ellis Island's not a thing until like 1890 or so. Before that, they come through at a place called Castle Clinton, which is still there today. It's the place in New York and Manhattan that you go to get your tickets to go see the Statue of Liberty. Pennsylvania, the Port of Philadelphia, is a very common place for people to come through as well. Virginia, a lot of this is from its early colonization. You're not seeing a lot of people settle directly in Virginia, though there was some migration from Pennsylvania to Virginia, particularly Mennonites, not Amish, but Mennonites, similar, in some ways, but who were pacifists who didn't want to take the loyalty oath to Pennsylvania and to the United States when the Revolution's going on. And so a lot of them settle in the Shenandoah Valley during the Revolution. So you see kind of a migration from Pennsylvania to Virginia. A lot of Scots-Irish, like the Ulster Scots as they're known, settle in Virginia and North Carolina. And so it's then those people that are going to be moving west into places like Kentucky and Tennessee. If you're like me and you have a lot of roots in Kentucky and Tennessee, you're going to have a lot of Scots-Irish roots. Ohio is settled heavily by a lot of German descent population from Pennsylvania. But also Connecticut, I should say. I live in Northeast Ohio, where we were originally the Connecticut Western Reserve. So now at this point, Ohio has moved well into third place in 1836. This is just... this is 33 years after Ohio has become a state. And I know I'm focused on them a lot, but that's where I'm from, so I know a lot about it. Kentucky has moved all the way up into sixth place. So you have now Ohio, Tennessee, and Kentucky in the top six. And like I said, that's all part of that westward migration. And then you're going to see the same kind of things happen in the later part of the 1800s and into the 1900s with the further west migration in places like California, which is just going to skyrocket in population. Now Indiana's going to start climbing here, and it's going to pass a lot of the South. So one of the things that you see happening now is the reduction of the South in terms of a percentage of overall population. Whereas before you had states like Virginia and North Carolina, two of the three most populous states in the Union, right up there at the top. Now the South is not nearly as populous. I mean, look, just Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio make up a third of the entire U.S. population. And Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky are slave states. But those three make up, 3 million people? Those three are equal to New York alone. So the influence of the South is starting to decrease in terms of a percentage of the population. And with it, their ability to influence presidential elections, their ability to have a say in the House of Representatives, because they don't represent as much of the population. And so that's going to cause them to be more combative when it comes to spreading slavery to new territories, because they realize the diminishing of their influence. And that's why we're going to start to come to a head when it comes to the slavery issue, and why we're just over a decade away from a civil war now. Just to catch up on states, Maine 1820, that's part of the Missouri Compromise. Missouri becomes a state in 1821. They enter in to balance each other out on the slavery issue. And so then for 15 years, you don't have another state admitted to the Union. Arkansas in 1836, Michigan in 1837. So again, one slave state, one free state, keeping that balance because each state brings with it two new United States senators who are voting on issues concerning slavery. Florida in 1845, Texas in 1845, Iowa and Wisconsin in 46 and 48, again balancing things back out. 1850, California becomes a state, and that happened really quickly. Because you look here, California is not even on this list. Michigan's down there at 400,000, and we don't see California. I think in order to become a state, among other things, you had to have something like 60,000 in population. I don't remember the exact number, but it was around that number, and then there were other requirements you had to meet as well. And then no new states until Minnesota joins in 1858. And we'll stop there to kind of see where things are. Now you see further westward migration. Now you're seeing Illinois climbing up, and it's all the way up to fourth. And so now What are the 5 largest states in the Union in terms of population? They're all northern states: New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. You take Virginia out, and then you've got Massachusetts. Missouri now climbs because now the westward migration is happening again, and Missouri is kind of the jumping off point for the Oregon Trail, for going to California and to Oregon and to what will become Washington. But now, again, you see the North heavily favored in population. We're at 30 million people. And as the Civil War starts, we're at 32.5 million people. And now Massachusetts has moved up. And so Virginia is the most populous Confederate state. And it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th in population. And then Kentucky, then Tennessee. So you can see the issue that the Confederacy has in terms of manpower. New York's got 4 million people. It's got, 3.5 times the population of Virginia. Pennsylvania has 3 million people. Ohio's got 2.4 million. Illinois, 1.8 million. Indiana, 1.4 million. The South is just in real trouble here. Now, Illinois is 1868. You've got railroads. And railroads are going to make it much easier to move west. We're getting to the place with the Transcontinental Railroad now. And so now it's going to become much easier to get west. It doesn't become this arduous journey where everyone dies of dysentery on the Oregon Trail. So you're going to start to see much more growth in Illinois, Missouri, places further west. Illinois is about to move into 3rd place. Chicago has the fire, but then sees a huge rebirth and new growth in the aftermath of the Great Chicago Fire. So Ohio and Illinois both see a lot of growth there. 1877, at this point, we're in the middle of a string of Ohio presidents. You've got Ulysses S. Grant, who was born in Ohio. Rutherford Hayes was born in Ohio. Benjamin Harrison, James Garfield, William McKinley, and then eventually you're going to have Harding. So a lot of Ohio presidents happening at this time. It has a lot of influence. It's kind of a moderate Republican state at this time with a strong Democratic presence as well. Interestingly, Ohio has never had a Democrat president. All 7 presidents that were born in Ohio were Republicans. They were all in that 60-year or so stretch after the American Civil War when Midwestern Republicans dominated national politics. So now you're starting to see Texas climb up, and Texas is going to start to grow. Michigan's growing now as well. Texas is climbing fast. Illinois finally passes Ohio. And notice how far down Virginia is now. Remember when we started this? In 100 years, Virginia goes from being the most populous state to not even being in the top 10. And honestly, Virginia has only barely doubled in population in 100 years, whereas places like New York and Pennsylvania have vastly increased. Some places that didn't even have people in them have increased and gone all the way up to the top 5. Texas is about to climb, though, and it's going to make its way. Now you're starting to see Illinois putting a big gap between it and Ohio. Texas moves up. Massachusetts is starting to grow again. It's going to get back into the top 6. Here goes Wisconsin, which, Wisconsin's not far from Chicago. A half-hour drive or so from Chicago, you're in Wisconsin. And then, so you've got people settling in Wisconsin who maybe are coming from Chicago. And here's California, 1909. Now watch what California does. I don't remember the exact numbers or when it happens, but it's absolutely ridiculous how fast California grows. Right now, 2.3 million people in 1909. The U.S. population is 92 million. The golden age of immigration is taking place in that period from like the post-Civil War up through like the 1920s. So remember, 1865 or 1861, the U.S. population is 35 million. It's almost tripled in the last 50 years since then. And watch how fast it's growing. And you see how quickly New York's going up, and a lot of that's New York City. Again, that's where all the immigrants are going before they eventually go to other places. There's California, already just like that up there, but boy, they're just getting started. So right there, 1916, California hits 3 million people. So 1922, they've hit 4 million people. So 25% population increased in 6 years. And now they're going to pass Texas. They're going to blow past everybody at this point. But New York's grown a lot too. Look, because of the immigration and things like that. Look, 1913, New York's got, actually, let's go back a little further. Just under 9 million people they've got in 1908. We get up to 1922, and now they're at 11 million, and it's just going to grow exponentially from there. And just to kind of recap, since the Civil War, we've got, so going back to just before the Civil War, Oregon becomes a state in 1859, Kansas in 1861, West Virginia 63, Nevada 64, Nebraska 67. So there's a lot of new states happening there. That's what, since 1858 with Minnesota, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 6 in a period of 9 years. And then Colorado in 76. And then in November of 1889, you add North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington. In 1890, you add Idaho and Wyoming. So a slew of states in like a year and a half. Actually, less than a year between November and July of 1889, 1890. Utah in 1896. So that's up to 45 states. And then you have Oklahoma in 1907, New Mexico in 1912, Arizona in 1912, and then Alaska and Hawaii in 1959. But 1922, California is at 4 million people. 1927, 5 years later, 5 million people. That's 200,000 new people a year. That's 20% increase in 5 years. This is just massive, massive growth by California. And you see now how top-heavy the union is getting in terms of some of the larger populations. Just Ohio, Illinois, I mean, New York alone, look at almost 12 million people. U.S. population is 119 million, and like a third of that is the top 4 states. It's just crazy. Michigan, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Missouri, Indiana. So, yeah, not a lot of change is going to happen in the lower parts of this list. California is the real big mover at this point. Arizona will see some growth, I think. We'll see them climb in. There, California passes Texas in the 1930s. Now it's going to pass Ohio. And just like that, I mean, 1941, this is where we're at the beginning of the Second World War. You have New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, California, Ohio, Texas, and then Michigan. And that's where your heavy population centers are going to be. Pennsylvania is about to be the second state to hit 10 million people. But look at California. I mean, that's just crazy growth. So 1941, California is at 7.37 million people. By 46, California is at 9 million people. 1.5 million in 4 years. I mean, 5 years. This growth just continues. And so a lot of that probably has to do with World War I. You've got naval activity happening on the West Coast. You've got, a lot of things happening. So again, we're seeing shifts in population. I'm waiting for Arizona to show up on the scene. Now here's Florida. Here's another one. A lot of people don't realize that, back in the Civil War, Florida was a Confederate state, but there was like nobody living in Florida. So much of the South, especially, was swamp. I mean, Orlando and Miami, these were areas that nobody wanted to live then, but now they're huge attractions for not only for people to live, but also for vacation. So Florida, watch them, 2.7 million in 1949. Watch how quickly it's going to rise as California continues to take off. People are moving to the south, to the west. They're moving to sun, to better weather. This is a time when people have more income to be able to do these things, and transportation's much easier. But New York just continues to go nuts too. I mean, look at that. 1951. Let's go back. 1941, 13.5 million. Now 15 million. So doing the same kind of thing. But look at Florida. Watch how fast Florida and California are climbing up. So it's going to be, mid-1960s, we're going to see California become the most populous state. It's right about the time that Ronald Reagan becomes governor of California. And now the U.S. population in 1969 hits 200 million people. And we see Florida is up to 6.5 million. Where were they? 1950. Florida's got almost 2.8 million. So the population doubles in the span of 20 years. Now California's just going to blow everybody away. And there goes Texas. Texas is starting to close the gap with New York big time. Here comes Florida. It's about to pass Ohio. So even then, 1986, Florida's at 11.9 million people. And, every 10 years when we do a United States Census, they recalculate how many representatives in Congress each state gets, because there's a static number, 435 voting members of Congress. And that gets reapportioned based on the population. So as population shifts, so do the number of representatives. We've lost representatives in every census that I've been alive for. Because Ohio, while the population continues to grow, it's growing at a disproportionate rate to some other places. So even in 1986, California's got almost 28 million people. But look where it's at now. My goodness. Texas moves past New York to become second. Florida's at fourth at this point. Pennsylvania passes Ohio. Florida's about to pass New York. And a lot of that is direct correlation. There's a lot of New Yorkers that move to Florida, especially in retirement. There, Florida moves into third. So now, 2012-ish, for the first time, you have California, Texas, and Florida, the three highest in population, followed by New York. And you can see now, though it's subtle, Georgia and North Carolina have been growing, and you're seeing shifts in population there. Again, moves toward the south to nicer weather. So now we're getting to the present day and a little bit past. And you can see there that 340 million people, 70 million of which are in California and Texas. And yet huge chunks of Texas are still just empty. There's counties in Texas that have just a few thousand people. But we're seeing a shift. Arizona, 7.5 million people. I think that's probably going to continue to grow. And they're going to probably continue to move up the list. Illinois passes Pennsylvania. Virginia moves back up. Here Arizona's moving again. And by this point, Georgia and North Carolina have passed Ohio, and I totally can see that being the case. A lot of people I went to high school with have moved to North Carolina. It's a pretty popular destination for vacations for people from here as well. So the estimate here is that by 2050, you're going to see Georgia up into fifth in total population. North Carolina, sixth. The traditional kind of what we now know as like the Rust Belt, places like Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, Illinois, have dropped in terms of influence and population in favor of the South especially. So we're seeing a rise now in the South. Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, all in the top 6 there. So the prediction, of course, is that in 2050, this is what things are going to look like. Interesting. I think Mississippi has replaced that flag. Now, I don't know when this video was made, 2020. So, yeah, it might have happened after that. You see, we still do have a number of states that haven't hit 1 million in population. North Dakota, Alaska, Wyoming, and Vermont at that point. All right, that was pretty cool. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I thought it was a fun thing to do, a little bit different. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Observations, things maybe I should have mentioned that I didn't. If you want to check out the original content creator, you can do that through the link below. Thanks for watching.